Good afternoon. My name is Kalina Roshakov. I'm a reporter for Politico Europe, where I cover European climate politics and policy. Thank you very much for joining me. We've seen with the coronavirus crisis, climate change was temporarily knocked off the political agenda, but now that governments are discussing the economic recovery, climate change is having a comeback, and the discussion about how the EU might reach its climate neutrality is becoming an ever more prominent speaking point in recovery discussions, which is why I'm particularly glad to welcome you all here at this event today. We're discussing climate neutrality and the path to reaching climate neutrality. It's the first event of our Politico Energy Vision series. For those who have following us for the last years will be familiar with it. We're looking into energy discussions of today. We're following and bringing together energy stakeholders, and we are happy always to discuss exactly how to reach those goals that politicians are so prominently rallying around. First of all, thanks to our partner Shell, who made this virtual event possible. It's one of the many virtual events Politico Europe is now making thanks to the coronavirus crisis, so we're also entering new forms. And thanks to viewers online for joining. Please do ask questions. Just because you're virtual doesn't mean that we don't want your participation. So please do get engaged on Slido using the hashtag EnergyVisions. And do please also get involved on Twitter. With this, I hand over to Edward Daniels, Executive Vice President, Strategy and Portfolio with Shell.
Well, that's great. Thanks very much indeed. And I think this is the first time I've had quite so many people visiting me in the house here with me. So this virtual world has caused us to innovate in all sorts of strange and wonderful ways. These are extraordinary times. They are historic times. I think COVID-19 caused an immense amount of harm and damage to people, to businesses, to society at large. But it has also revealed to me the nature of the human condition, the ingenuity and the drive that people have to make the best out of what we've got. And in the same way, I think the European...
I'm hyper light sensitive.
The European Union has responded by adapting to the crisis presented before us. If we go back before COVID and think about what was on the agenda from an environmental perspective at the EU, we had the Green Deal, we had the climate law that was going to underpin that, we had the long-term objectives of getting to net zero emissions by 2050. Underpinning what we in Shell, and I know everyone here agrees, is the goal that we have of net zero emissions getting to less than 1.5 degrees pre-industrial levels in terms of temperature rises. Then, of course, along came the pandemic, and for a period of time, I think many of us worried that this was going to or damage our ability to get towards addressing the urgent sort of climate issues. I think the reality is that Europe has responded. The EU has responded. The European Economic Recovery Plan, or the Green Recovery Plan, is here now, and I think can make a real difference. I think it is the impetus that's really required to drive forward to net zero emissions by 2050. And in Shell, we've been thinking about this carefully. We developed a scenario about what does it take to decarbonize Europe by 2050, and I'd like to just articulate the ideas that came out of that about what will it take to make net zero emissions 2050 a reality. There were 9 areas. I'll be really quick to try and tell you about them. First of all, electrification. Probably about a 50% increase in the amount of power usage across Europe, and that power needs to be produced from renewable sources, from wind, from solar, and none of that power needs to be from coal. Thirdly, we've got to make sure that hydrogen is a significant part of the energy system, whether that's for domestic heating purposes or it's used for truck transport. We're talking about 1 million trucks on the road by 2050, very significant part. Fourthly, we're talking about the use of biofuels, particularly advanced biofuels, making sure that we have those at our disposal for things like long-haul aviation. Fifthly, energy efficiency. We need a 45% improvement in energy efficiency for us to be able to meet the sort of goals that we're after. Number 6, changing in consumer and business behavior, trying to do modal shifts of individuals and businesses from and freight from being in the air to being by rail. Number 7, we need a carbon price, about $200 a ton in our estimate, that will really drive and incentivize the behavior to reduce carbon emissions. Number 8, we need carbon capture and storage to be built. We need, I think, about 2 plants a month built between 2025 and 2050, like the Quest plant that we've built in Canada, storing over 1 million tons a year of CO2. We need that to be a vibrant part of the future economy. And finally, for the small amounts of CO2 that are left over, or small, 300 million tons, we believe, in 2050, we will need nature-based solutions to be able to mop up. So reforestation to be able to mop up those CO2 that can't be addressed in other ways. So that's about an area, in our estimate, of about a third of the size of France that we would need to reforest in order to address those final points. That's what we thought in our scenario. And let me just make clear, this is only about CO2 from energy. It doesn't include agriculture. It doesn't include process emissions from production of things like cement. So that would have to be addressed as well. Shell wants to be with and alongside the European Union in making this happen. We need to work collaboratively. The EU is seeking net zero emissions by 2050, and in April, we and Shell announced that we want to be a company that, with our customers, we want to be a net zero emissions energy company by 2050, taking into account the approach that our customers will take to reducing their emissions. We want to be able to work as a key player in driving towards net zero 2050. I freely admit this is very challenging. We're going to have to work at scale. We're going to have to work in real partnerships together. We're going to have to make lots of changes. So, we'll have to update and upgrade our business plans in order to be able to meet those ambitions. But we're changing already. We're changing already. And let me say that at this point, normally I would reel off a long list of examples of what we're doing. With the EU talking about its hydrogen strategy, I wanted to just focus on 3 very quick examples of what we're doing to drive the hydrogen economy in Europe. Firstly, we're building a network of hydrogen refueling stations across Germany in order to be able to demonstrate that. We're working with Toyota to look at fuel cells that will be required for the sort of trucks to be powered in the future. And finally, we have plans to build the largest sort of green electrolyzer in the port of Rotterdam to drive the hydrogen economy there. So Shell is moving forward, and I very much recognize the EU is moving forward as well. What will be really important, what is absolutely fundamental, if there's one point I'd want to leave with you, is the importance of the policy frameworks, the policy prescriptions that we put in place to enable these things to happen. There's one area I feel very strong, and we feel strongly about at Shell, is that a really good way, the best way to think about driving decarbonization is through an industry sector approach. That means that we think about our sectors, whether that's road or rail or aviation or marine, or it's cement or it's steel, and we work collaboratively in the ecosystem of that industry to work out what is the pathway to net zero emissions. So, for example, in trucks, it might be towards hydrogen. On passenger cars, it might be towards power. Working collaboratively as an industry, I think we can get together to work out what will be the demand that will be placed on the world for various goods and services to decarbonize these sectors. And then we, as energy providers, can put in place the plans, the investments that will be necessary to produce the goods, the services that will be required to help those sectors decarbonize. And it is then a real fundamental that we have the policies in place. So business can invest, they have the certainty to be able to make the investments, and therefore help to drive the ability of sectors to decarbonize over time. This will only be possible if we work as part of an overall society that wants to get to net zero emissions. We're going to have to work collaboratively. It's a collaboration between governments, between civil society and corporations that will make this happen. So each sector will have to work out its own pathway to decarbonization, whether that's aviation or it's marine, and perhaps it's best brought to life by an example. Last September at the UN Climate Week, we were a party in signing a Getting to Zero coalition. This is the marine industry coming together to have a plan that by 2030 we have a commercially viable ship that can be put to sea that shows how we will decarbonize the shipping industry. And that brought together ship designers, it brought together logistics experts, the ports, the fuel suppliers, the ship operators, heavy freight customers, Shell ourselves, part of that, working as a collaborative to work out exactly what will happen, how will that occur, and what will be the products that will be needed in order to serve that over time. As I've said, that needs to be part then of a broader societal push towards net zero emissions. Working together, that's for me probably the biggest other message I would give you, that this has got to be one of the biggest collaborations that we will require. Collaborating across the entire industry, collaborating businesses working with businesses. It'll be sectors working with governments and policymakers, and us all as a society working together to decarbonize, to get to net zero emissions. Time is very short, but if there's one thing that I've learned through the pandemic is the drive, the ingenuity of the human spirit really gives me encouragement that we can do this together. It's an opportunity that I really think we have to take. It's an opportunity we must take if we're really going to deliver net zero emissions 2050. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Edward. Thanks also for already outlining some of the concrete steps that will need to happen over the next years, and especially for putting into focus that these are there's a lot of necessary steps just needed to decarbonize the energy system, but then there's a lot of other sectors that will need to be decarbonized too, and I think that's a discussion I'd like to get to in a few moments. Before that, however, I'd also ask our audience already to get engaged online and on Slido. There's a poll that you can have a look at and vote on, which is looking into what action will have the biggest impact in achieving a climate neutral EU by 2050. So please do go online and do get involved. And now it's my pleasure to welcome KADRI SIMSON, the Energy Commissioner. She's here with me in the studio. And thank you very much for coming.
Thank you for inviting.
Bracing the coronavirus times and being here in person. So that's a great joy. As we already heard, there's a lot to do on the path to climate neutrality. In your job, you're overlooking the energy portfolios, so you'll be crucial to any EU efforts to decarbonize the economy more broadly. But I was wondering if we could start a bit of where we are at the moment. The European Commission has already started analyzing national energy and climate plans of the EU member states. And I assume that is already giving you an idea of how far or how close we are to 2030 energy goals. So what does that mean for our efforts to increase those goals, and what does that mean for our efforts to climate neutrality?
Well, I can say that we are doing a pretty good progress already. And before I will give you an answer about our 2030 current goals, I would like to share some ideas that I got last Thursday when Dr. Fatih Birol presented the International Energy Agency's in-depth review of EU energy policy. And what he told us was that here in European Union we have achieved our 2020 targets for greenhouse gas reduction, emission reduction already 2 years ago. So 2 years ago, 2018, the reduction compared to 1990 was 23 percentage points, and that means that that we can be ambitious. We have done what we promised so far, and of course this 2020 is not a good comparison year because of the lockdown measures. There is almost no mobility, but if we use the 2018 data, then we know that power generation has done its part. So we have invested into the renewables. We have had pretty good progress on energy efficiency, and member states have done great job with coal to gas transition. They have also played important part so that we achieved our reductions. Of course, there are other sectors, buildings, industry, transport. The progress there has been modest, and we can do so much more. And that's why we are right now evaluating the national energy and climate plans. We do have all of them except Ireland, because it is very good to know that Ireland just got a new governing coalition, and I have no doubt that they will send us very ambitious plan. But we do have the rest of them, and we will present the outcome in September, EU-wide outcome along with the 2030 targets. And then in October, I will present in front of the European Parliament the State of Energy Union, and then it will be accompanied by an annex where we evaluate every single plan country by country.
So based on what you're saying, and as part of the broader climate discussion in the EU, where we're now looking and waiting for the Commission to come out with a plan to raise the 2030 emissions reduction target from 40 to as high as 55%, so you would say 55% is possible?
I think that it is possible, and of course energy plays a very important part because 75% of the emissions are coming from this sector, production, transmission and usage. But other sectors have to do their part too. From our point of view, we know that according to the current national energy and climate plans, we are doing pretty well on renewables. Not so well on energy efficiency, but there are certain initiatives that we can launch that help us to achieve higher targets. And we shouldn't waste also the current crisis. So when European Commission proposed a stronger MFF along with the Next Generation EU recovery plan, then this recovery plan is built around two pillars, so green transition and digital transition. And I truly hope that member states will propose very good projects that help them to achieve higher climate goals, but at the same time create jobs and strengthen their competitiveness.
Yeah.
And one of this kind of initiatives is the renovation wave. So we know
which you will present a proposal which you will present in the fall. No?
And I already have received a very good reactions to it. We discussed it with energy ministers during the last energy ministerial, and it ticks three boxes. It helps us to achieve our energy efficiency targets because right now 40% of the energy is consumed in building sector, mainly heating and cooling. Renovation also creates jobs, and creates jobs all around Europe in every region, and it helps us to secure public acceptance, because after you have renovated your building, you can have a nice and comfortable temperature, but your heating bills will be significantly smaller.
Yeah.
So it helps us to target the energy poverty question, and also shows to the wider audience that being more efficient means also smaller bills.
I'd like to come back to that issue also with the panel, because renovation has come up not only in an introductory speech by Shell, but also by many others over the last weeks and months. But to come back to some of the energy initiatives that you're now planning, you're due to come out with a strategy next week on promoting hydrogen in the EU economy. We already had Germany present its own strategy a couple of weeks ago, setting in a way an example and perhaps where it should be going. So is there any chance that you can give us already a preview of exactly what the Commission would like to promote in detail and whether you're only going to bet, for example, on renewable-based hydrogen, or whether gas might still have to play a future over the next years.
This is very true that next Wednesday Commission should adopt 2 strategies. One of them is hydrogen strategy, but another one is energy system integration strategy. And these are 2 strategies that help us to achieve our long-term 2050 targets. Because energy system integration will address 3 topics without doing so, we will not achieve climate neutrality. First of all, energy efficiency and how we will waste less energy. So how we can reuse waste energy, residues, how we can use, for example, agricultural waste and produce renewable gases. The other topic that we will address is electrification, because we know that if we want to achieve climate neutrality, we should use more renewables, and the electricity sector is an obvious option because it consists of most of the renewables. So end-use sectors like transport or heating and central heating, how to use more heat pumps, for example. The third topic is how we will address those sectors where electrification is difficult or impossible. Steel, cement, industrial processes, but also part of the transport, so heavy-duty vehicles, where electrification is not an option, or at least it's too costly. And in that perspective, the hydrogen certainly comes along. So of course we will promote renewable hydrogen because of the emissions. We will use hydrogen as a solution for those sectors where we can't use direct electrification. At the same time, it helps us also in the question how we can store renewables. So of course we need more offshore wind energy, but there are certain time slots where demand is lower than production. And hydrogen, green hydrogen can be a solution there. And then hydrogen, of course, helps us in wider context, because we do have close neighborhoods where it is very easy to produce renewables. Eastern Partnership or Africa. And hydrogen might be a solution how they can produce renewables and we can consume them. But we do know that right now the share of renewable hydrogen is very small, and industry who will be the consumer side. They need certainty that the demand is covered in every moment. That's why in short and medium term we also address the low carbon hydrogen, because this also helps us to lower the emissions.
So concretely though, how will you, because I think by now everyone's agreed hydrogen is a thing. Even after a few years ago, hydrogen wasn't yet a thing. Now it's really the thing, the magical silver bullet solver of all problems. But how concretely do you promote that? Because I think you can put out a strategy, but are you going to concretely promote, for example, coming out with financial support schemes for renewables-based hydrogen? Or are you also in part of the broader energy integration strategy? Are you going to propose new ways of incentivizing the uptake in member states?
Well, there are certain funds that that sector can use, and some of them will be open already before the next MFF. So, for example, the first call for innovation fund, almost 1 billion euro. The first call is, the volume is almost 1 billion euros. But together with Commissioner Thierry Breton, we will also launch Clean Hydrogen Alliance. This will be launched next Wednesday, and it will bring together the national authorities, sector, both from production side and transmission side and consumers, industry, so that the main goal is to create a market, because we do have the technology right now, but it's not competitive yet. So if we will manage to scale up the market, then our experience tells us that the similar success story like has happened with offshore wind or solar panels, where bigger volumes are bringing down the cost, is achievable also in the renewable hydrogen.
As you already said, hydrogen is one of the industrial sectors that Brussels wants to promote, and you already mentioned that as part of the broader recovery proposal that is also going to be discussed by EU leaders later in July. Hydrogen and renewables played a role. How do you make sure, though, that EU members really follow through with the green objectives that Brussels has in mind? And do you think that the green suggestions in the recovery package are sufficient to really enforce a green recovery?
When Commission proposed a new, stronger MFF, then the principle that we have mainstreaming 25% of the funds should be dedicated to climate-related actions. This is still very valid. Now on the next generation EU funds, the allocation is different, but almost all the funds member states can also use for energy-related projects. So for me, it is very important that when member states will propose their recovery and resilience plans, then they must be in line with European semester recommendations, but also in line with national energy and climate plans and just transition plans. And well, just transition, this is directly only for green transition. So yes, we need a very good cooperation with member states so that they will propose good projects, because they can also propose, for example, digital projects.
But could we imagine, essentially, could it be possible the Commission just says no to a member state plan? I mean, is that even feasible?
I think that this is a good rehearsal, and we have to find a reasonable setup. But when we proposed our Green Deal, then it was not only climate plan, but it was also our growth strategy. And right now, all what we need is growth and more better jobs, and also new technological solutions. So I think that energy-related investments are well received in that perspective.
So you will rely a lot on enlightened self-interest, that member states will do the right thing, so that Brussels doesn't have to come down hard on them.
Absolutely. And from our side, we also need high-level political decisions. We need that climate law will be adopted so that we will send a clear message also to the industry and private sector that we are serious with our 2050 targets, and investments into the green technological solutions are safe. And also we need that heads of the governments will agree on next MFF and next generation EU proposal, because this gives us the tools how member states can achieve what they already promised, and how can they secure the public acceptance. Because, for example, Just Transition Fund, that is now according to our proposal, as big as 40 billion euros. It is crucial to help those regions who are heavily dependent on either mining solid fossil fuels, or who are regions where there is a production that is carbon intensive.
Yeah, it'd be great to get back to the Just Transition debate with our panel, especially because we see an interesting development where the European Parliament seems to, or at least some committees seem to try to open the way for gas investments, while the Council is for once more ambitious on that front. But let's get back to that on the panel. On the climate law, you already said we need the climate law. Do you think it's possible to agree that by the end of the year? Do you think the Germans will be able to push through a deal by December 31?
The German presidency starts tomorrow, and they are very ambitious. So I do have great hopes, and I do see a big ambition also from European Parliament side. So there are all necessary conditions to achieve the agreement. But of course, well, you never know. but the chance is there.
And the Commission will push on the 55% reduction target.
Well, we do have impact assessment for both 50 and 55% reduction. We need to, well, if we will propose, we need to also show to the wider audience how we will achieve it. And there are different ways we can open our energy efficiency or renewable targets, but we can do also significant things in ETS. So right now the discussions are ongoing, and the proposal will be ready by the end of September.
Great, thanks very much. On that note, we're moving on to our Q&A session. And so I'd be happy to welcome our panelists. If I start with Pascal Canfin, who many will know is the chair of the European Parliament's Environment Committee, a French Renew Europe MEP, who might be a little sad this week that he left the party who made such great victories over the weekend in France. So it'd be interesting to hear him, a first assessment of how he sees the French regional elections outcome and what that means perhaps for climate change more broadly, but I'll come back to that. I also welcome Adam Giborgi-Szotwertyński, the Undersecretary of State at the Polish Climate Ministry, Mechthild Wörsdorfer, Director for Sustainability, Technology and Outlooks at the International Energy Agency. Many Brussels insiders will still remember her as a senior energy official, so Mechthild was very much involved in the climate neutrality debate and the proposal, so happy to have her. And also I'd like to just mention that we are happy to have Poppy KALESI, Director of Global Energy at the Environmental Defense Fund, who will make a few comments during the panel debate. Welcome to all. And thanks to KADRI for staying. It's a great pleasure to have the Commissioner here, so I look forward to also discussion amongst the panel participants. So please do interrupt me if you want to ask KADRI a question, since now's your chance. But I'm ready to jump off a point that you had raised, especially with the economic recovery and how that could serve as a way for member states as they're looking to implement programs to rebuild and pull their economies out of the pandemic hole, to go for more climate-friendly solutions. And Adam, I would like to turn to you. Poland is eternally under pressure to become greener. There is never a debate where Poland is mentioned for its coal reliance and its reluctance, sometimes more openly, sometimes less, to embrace ambitious climate targets, even though developments are changing. So do tell me, what does Poland now need to become climate neutral, and what do you expect Brussels to do, especially in the run-up to these initiatives that we'll see play out over the fall?
Thanks for having me on this discussion. I think it's a very timely discussion in the context of the work that we are carrying out both in Brussels and in the capitals on the ways out of the crisis we are facing. We have been giving some thoughts also internally in Poland of which of these investments that are critical for the transformation of our energy sector, for the transformation of our economy towards climate neutrality, which of these investments also have the potential to generate growth, to generate employment, and to be an answer to the difficult economic times we're going through following the pandemics. And in the Ministry of Climate, we've looked at the these different sectors, and they're largely, very similar to the ones identified by the Commission, like renovation of buildings, developing renewables, improving energy efficiency, generally developing electromobility. And these are all projects that we could implement quickly and that could trigger a positive effect on the economy. And we drew up a list of in total more than 2 billion euros of projects that could be implemented quickly, with that double effect of getting us on track of the climate goals and also giving that additional kick to the economy. So I definitely think that there is absolutely synergy between the two objectives, and this is something that we should continue.
And in terms of concretely what you expect from Brussels, because Poland has often raised the practical concern that it's great to talk about climate neutrality, but now that everybody kind of rallies around the goal, it's really time to move towards the practicalities, however mundane they might be, and discuss money, technical support, and other issues. So what concretely do you need from Brussels?
Yes. So I do agree that investments are definitely a big part of the equation. They're not the only challenge that we have. I think we have a bit of tendency in the EU sometimes of getting lost in discussing for ages on a figure, whether we should have 27.8 or 27.67% of whatever. And we lose sight of the end game of what is the ultimate objective. And I think our prime ministers were very clear. They agreed in December last year. We are aiming for a climate neutral EU by 2050. That's what we have set. And now we really need to start discussing the tools that we need to have in place to reach that. And they are obviously financial, and it certainly is critical, especially in times of crisis. To make sure that we don't design a policy that will create additional burdens on the most vulnerables and the poorest of our citizens. But it's also a matter of having the appropriate regulations, the appropriate, standards for maybe for some sectors, more bigger push for innovation in other sectors, as there are many actions that we cannot effectively undertake at national level, and we really need to coordinate and to choose a common direction in the EU if we want the transformation of these sectors to be possible. So I think having this plan how to reach climate neutrality is really the key thing. It obviously has to include a financial element, but it's not the only instrument that will be crucial to reach our targets.
Thanks, Pascal. As the chair of the Environment Committee, you're overseeing difficult discussions on the climate law, and you're very much involved in exactly that discussion. How do you make climate neutrality possible? So also based on Adam's comments, what beyond finance, what measures do you think European policymakers need to push now to make that path towards climate neutrality a reality, and in the more near term, make raising the 2030 emissions reduction target possible too?
Well, good afternoon first. Well, we really need to work always on a triangle. This triangle is first the standards we need to put in place, so the rules of the game. Second, the technologies, because if we put a standard on paper, but there is no technology to deliver, then of course at the end it's just a paper standard. And third is the financing. And that's why in the climate law, for instance, I tabled amendments in order to create a consistent roadmap for sectors, or consistent roadmaps per sector or per value chain, precisely in order to put together these triangles. Which standards, which norms, which technologies do we need, do we have? So how to massively scale up when we have it, or to have a R&D effort when we don't have it yet, and the financing side in order to make things moving in the right direction for real. And if we do not have these three angles of the triangle, that it doesn't work. So that's always what I have in mind when I discuss with decision makers, like the one we have today in the panel, and I hello to all of them. And we need to keep that in mind in order to move forward, including in Poland, because I really don't think that we should leave Poland behind, and I don't think now the Polish society is willing to be left behind. I think things are moving and are changing very rapidly as well in Poland.
In your work, which sectors do you now think really need a push and might have been underestimated or just not been focused enough in recent years?
Well, it's quite objective when you look at the figures. It's always about 4 or 5 key sectors. And I would say that with the ETS, we have the right tool to adjust progressively the capping of CO2 emissions for the European industries. And then there is a very tough discussion when we will reopen the ETS in order to strengthen it. There will be tough discussions on the carbon price, the linear reduction factor, and so on and so on and so on, but we have the tool. It's already designed. For housing, and KADRI recalled us that it's the sector with transportation which are lagging behind. We do not have the proper tool at the European level. So that's why I'm very keen on having a strong renovation wave initiative coming in September from the Commission, and I hope that the national recovery and resilience plans will put a lot of emphasis on this sector in the pocket of the green investments, because obviously it's something where we are all lagging behind. And just maybe a suggestion to you, KADRI, I think the housing ministers in the member states, they don't really feel as a European team, because Europe doesn't have that strong power or toolbox when it comes to housing policies. It's mainly national. They don't meet each other, they don't know how it works, and so on. So if I took the case I know quite well, France, there will be a huge added value in gathering the housing ministers with you, KADRI, or with Frans Timmermans, in order precisely to co-design together the housing renovation side of the recovery package in September in relation with the renovation wave. So to take two, and maybe the third one is obviously the food system. And that's where the reform of the CAP, of the Common Agricultural Policy, will be key, and that's why we worked very much on this, and we welcome the Farm to Fork initiative from the Commission, because one of the key elements of the reform of the CAP we are working on from the Parliament side is precisely to have consistency between the next CAP and the Green Deal, because we can't afford not to have consistency there.
Thanks for that, KADRI, especially jumping off the point of consistency across policy areas. And I think you already mentioned that the Green Deal is seen and promoted as a growth program that, however, would also require governments to discuss the Green Deal as a comprehensive issue that affects all ministers and not just environment and energy. So will we see from the Commission a greater push to breaking down the policy silos over the next months and years to really discuss these subjects on that and really promote the idea of climate neutrality, like Canfin said, Pascal said, broadening the scope of this of ministers that are relevant for example, renovation wave to housing ministers?
Yes, and thank you, Pascal, for very good advice, because, well, I know very well that if we want to double the renovation rates, then we need very good partnership with national governments, but also local authorities. And I myself, I thought towards covenant of mayors, because this is a very useful organization, more than 10,000 signatories, and we need to share best practices, because this in some member states it is still a huge challenge how to organize renovation of one multi-apartment building where there might be tens or hundreds of different owners. In Commission point of view, we truly try to break silos, and the best example is our hydrogen strategy, because there are several commissioners who are strongly involved, from consumption side, industry. Hydrogen is very important in the energy sector as a energy carrier, as a useful tool how we can accommodate more renewables, but also research and innovation, state aid rules. All the different commissioners have to be on board. And in that perspective, at least two clusters, commissioners' clusters, Green Deal and Margaret Vestager's cluster, are closely involved. And these kind of strategies, I think, will also bring along different member states, despite the fact that right now there are not so many good examples across the EU, but lots of interest already.
I'd like to come back to that in a bit, but now to Mechthild, you've been working in the Commission for years and years and years. Now you're with the IEA, so you have an insiders, outsiders, outsiders, insiders view. So what's Brussels missing? What are its blind spots that you can perceive a bit more clearly from the outside now when it comes to the EU's climate neutrality strategy?
So thank you very much, and thank you also for inviting me, and good afternoon from Paris. Very pleased and very happy to listen and be part of that panel. So the IEA has been looking at the impact of the corona crisis, very much so, the huge impact in the energy system. We have looked at investments, and we had very recently published what could be part of the recovery globally. The IEA is an agency with more than 30 members. The EU is part of it, but obviously also France and many European countries, but also US, Canada, Australia, Korea, and others. And we have a family, how we call it, with China, India, and other countries. So 75% of energy demand. So I think in that sense, EU is doing a great job. I mean, has been doing and is continuing to do a great job with the European Green Deal and the ambition it had. And it can set the example which other regions can follow. So I think in that sense, the EU with we heard from the commissioner with the plans they had, but also with the existing 2030 framework and the focus on renewables, energy efficiency and other technologies, hydrogen, is the right way to do. But there is one thing I would like to underline when we discuss it. EU is hugely important with the 27 countries, but it's roughly 8% of the global CO2 emissions. So I think the good thing is that the EU can lead, be the example, but it's also good to be in dialogue with other regions, to reach out to China, India, US, Canada, Africa. We are just finishing a big event which we organized today on Africa with many African ministers. So I think the IEA can be supportive in that sense to reach out to much more globally. But a lot of good things the EU is doing. I think there's a huge interest and others can learn from it. When it comes to the technology and innovation, the focus is good. I mean, hydrogen is certainly one of the promising, and the carrier is very well explained, but there are also others, I would say. We shouldn't only look at hydrogen. I think Shell mentioned CCUS, can be a combination of CCS, CCU, and hydrogen for some sectors. Port of Rotterdam was mentioned as a hub where it can work together with energy suppliers, but also hard to abate or energy intensive industries and bring them together. So I think the approach is very good, but there are more innovation and technologies which are needed for 2050, certainly for a net zero 2050 globally. If EU starts and takes the lead, I think we really need to work also with others to have that global approach and also hopefully get to net zero globally, which is even more difficult than to get it at EU level. Thank you.
Thanks for that. I'd love to get Poppy involved, but just first pop a quick question to KADRI in response to Mechthild's comments. Will we see a stronger focus on carbon capture and storage or utilization technologies and support over the next months from the Commission? Is that something on your agenda?
Well, yes, we will address this topic in several occasions. And one of the promises that I gave to members of European Parliament is that by the end of this year we will also review the 10E regulation. So all the technological solutions that are needed for our climate targets. But another thing, Mechthild mentioned that we need to be ambitious for different innovative solutions. Europe is a leading force on offshore wind technology. And one of the lessons from this current crisis was that several onshore but also offshore auctions, renewable auctions, were either postponed or cancelled. And one of the reasons was uncertainty of the financing. But another reason was that our production lines tend to be somewhere else, or the supply chain is too long. So part of our recovery proposal is also a strategic investment facility so that we can bring back strategic production. And I do see that there are several energy-related productions that we should also bring back to Europe.
Poppy, turning to you. You've been observing energy policy for a long while. What do you make of the comments so far, and from a civil society perspective, what jumps to mind?
Well, thank you very much for offering the opportunity to share our views. I think overall I will have to say that all the views and the visions we have heard today are extremely inspiring. And they are the right visions in terms of developing the energy system for the future. However, I would like to bring in the picture another angle of Europe's many levers to influence global emissions. And that is really the impact of domestic climate policies beyond the EU's borders. So to explain what I mean, so far, many of the visions have been focusing very much on the supply side in developing technology. And one thing that is a very important lever that the EU has is that it also is the second biggest consumer region in the world. So my suggestion is that everyone should be thinking a little bit more consciously about the effectiveness of the EU's external action on energy and climate, which is going to be a lot more credible if it's based on methane, on ambitious domestic policy. And I would offer a very concrete example, which is a really big opportunity we have now in front of us to use this leverage to drive down global methane emissions for all gas produced globally, but imported into the EU. So methane is often the greenhouse gas that is left outside the debate, which is mostly focusing on CO2. And a net zero vision really is about reductions across greenhouse gases. So methane is important in a 2030 context because it is 84 to 87 times more potent than CO2 over a 20-year period. And this means that no strategy to stabilize our climate can succeed without ambitious action on methane. So addressing methane, especially in the context of the oil and gas industry, is one of the most cost-effective options, as the IEA's recovery report very clearly recommended. So I would say that my invitation to all the speakers today is to really think about how the forthcoming Commission initiatives on, a methane strategy, the sector integration, hydrogen, can also offer important policy opportunities and levers to quickly cut methane emissions in the EU's gas supply chain. And I am extremely heartened to hear very pragmatic approaches that all the speakers have brought on focusing on the supply chain and value chains, because this is the right level to focus on. So I would say that what we do now and over the next 10 years will be critical to both securing a net zero future, but also a competitive position for emerging technologies. And I would like to sit here and state that whatever the future role of gas in Europe is, it is essential for the EU to articulate firm sustainability requirements on gas now to make gas use consistent with a net zero future. And the reason is simple. Gas is simply too cheap, and it will be very hard for hydrogen and other emerging technologies to compete on a level playing field with natural gas. So we would recommend, the Environmental Defence Fund would recommend a 0.2% methane performance standard, certifying that all gas consumed in the EU is responsibly produced. And that would be a critical first step. So my suggestion to all of you is to let us make the most of these opportunities to go beyond the what of the targets to the how of sound economic and financial incentives, which is very much echoing what all of you said. I think that will further tip the balance in favor of renewables. And of course, CDF stands ready to help.
Thanks, Poppy, for raising that issue of leverage, especially because it's something that the EU always prides itself on this idea that it's very, and Brussels especially, very active in policy making and often leads the world in its legislative framework. So I'd be interested in coming back to the panelists and ask them what they think the priority policy measures should be that European policymakers should tackle over the next year. But before that, I think it's time to turn to Q&A. And I look forward to questions from the audience. Which one of the top questions that we were given is by a person called Marens. Unfortunately, we don't have the surname. Asking that in addition to the renovation wave, will the European Commission systematically apply the energy efficiency first principle to all energy policy making, planning and investments? That question is addressed to KADRI, so it'd be great to hear your answer on that.
Yes, indeed. Energy efficiency first principle is still the core principle. So if we want to achieve our ambitious targets for 2050, that also means that we shouldn't waste energy. And this is exactly one of the topics that we will address in our energy system integration strategy. How we can use waste heat that comes from data centers, from industry, so that we will become more energy efficient. And if I may take 30 seconds and reply to Poppy's comments on gas and methane emissions, then this is also one thing which shows that inside the Commission we can very well cooperate among different commissioners. We will present a methane strategy that addresses not only methane leakage in energy sector, but together with other commissioners we will also address agricultural sector and waste management. And this is very true that we are big importers of oil and gas at the moment, and this puts us also responsibility.
So when can we expect that strategy?
This year.
So it's one of many initiatives,
Exactly.
Which then I guess Brussels will follow up with legislative proposals. And with that, I would like to turn to Pascal and Adam, especially to hear what according to you are the most necessary legislative changes that will have to happen over the next year or the next years to really tighten environmental standards and make sure that the EU reduces emissions in line with its climate neutrality goal. Pascal, if I may start with you.
Okay. Well, if I look at the proposals in the Green Deal communication or framework, we got everything we need. I mean, the reform of the CAP and its alignment with the Green Deal. Of course, we have the MFF discussion and the recovery package. We have the climate law. We have the ETS reform. We have the new potential CO2 standards for cars and lorries. We have the carbon border adjustment mechanisms. I mean, we have on the paper, on our workload, I would say, and ahead of us, everything we need to make it right. So I don't think we need to spend too much time again to reinvent the wheel or to invent anything new. Let's deliver now what we have on our plate and what is in the pipe of the Commission first and then of the co-legislators later on. Maybe one word on gas, if you allow me.
Please.
We are discussing this and negotiating this in the Parliament first in the context of the Just Transition Fund, because we will vote on it in July, so very, very soon. And the vision of the majority, and which is mine as well, is that we should use the taxonomy. So we voted the taxonomy, we agreed on the taxonomy last December. I co-chaired the trilogues, so I know that text quite well. And I think it's the right tool to be used to precisely make the difference when it comes to the public financing of gas. Because gas, I mean, you can look at it both ways. When it replaces coal, obviously you have short-term CO2 gain, or carbon gain, it's obvious. But you have the lock-in effect in 10 years' time, and then you are trapped. And you can move from coal to gas, but then you can not move from gas to renewables and zero carbon and carbon neutrality. So that's why when we design the tools today, we have to think about it not only for tomorrow morning, but for the next decades. That's why the taxonomy is, to my view, one very important tool to move out from a black or white vision, which I think is a bit either extreme or simplistic, and to adjust what we should finance with a level playing field and a common vision all around Europe. And the second, for gas, the second issue, and KADRI knows quite well that it's a strong request from the Parliament, and is that there is a need for assessment by the Commission of the consistency of all the new gas projects that are in the pipe to be financed. That could be either from the Just Transition Fund or the PCI list or other funds, whatever they are. The Commission has to design an assessment of the consistency of gas projects with the Green Deal, taking into account the taxonomy, obviously, and taking into account the potential lock-in effect over the next decades, let's say 10, 15, 20 years, and making sure that we modelize it right so that we can take the maximum of short-term gains without being trapped and without becoming inconsistent with climate neutrality, or without becoming to have a lot of potential stranded assets in 2030, 2035, 2040. So that's a strong request for the Parliament, which is not a yes or no, but which is let's think about it smartly, consistently with the climate neutrality and the Green Deal.
KADRI, is that something you can already commit to now? I mean, you already went to the European Parliament, and earlier this year, I think you, and together with Frans Timmermans, the EU Green Deal chief, pledged to review the cross-border energy infrastructure projects regulation to see whether support would continue to go towards gas infrastructure. Is that something that we will see in future, or will you have to say, okay, because of our climate goals, no more public support for gas infrastructure?
Well, we do know that in European Parliament there are different views. There are political groups who are supporting in the transition period usage of gas because, as Pascal was mentioning, if you replace coal or more polluting sources with gas, then the significant gains in short term are visible. So, for example, Greece is phasing out lignite, replacing it with gas, and greenhouse gas emissions are significantly smaller. We have to be aware that along with our climate goals, there are also energy security of supply topic and also affordability, because if national governments can't show to their consumers that they will not be losers because of the higher prices, then it's very difficult to raise a target and raise a pace. And this is what we are asking from them. So I do agree that if we will achieve our 2050 target, then we are talking only about decarbonized gases. And in that perspective, biogas, using of agricultural residues and producing fuels here inside the European Union and not importing them is very important. Also, renewable hydrogen in that respect is very important. But in short perspective, building highly efficient cogeneration plants that produce both heat and power is a solution, and according to the treaty, all the member states, they can decide what will be their energy mix. So this has been also a clear statement that during the transition period, gas is accepted fossil fuel, but we don't want to invest into stranded assets. So all the investments, they must be future-proof.
So I see there's still a lot of discussions within the European Commission until
Indeed, and I do expect very good debates also with the European Parliament, because there is a clear division of the views towards gas projects.
Great. Let us again turn to questions from the audience. There is one from Anonymous, who's asking everyone, did you listen to Greta? I assume he means Greta Thunberg, the Swedish climate activist, who's regularly criticized also the EU's climate targets for too little. And the person says she's not very optimistic. Are the EU member states doing enough and fast enough? So if I could get a yes or no answer from all the panelists, that'd be excellent, starting with Pascal.
I talked too much already, so of course
just a yes or no. I only need a yes or no.
I received Greta in the ENVI committee in the European Parliament, so we had the opportunity to discuss, and it's very clear she's pushing hard in the right direction, but then it's our responsibility to find the right compromises, because as KADRI said, it's about climate, but it's also about fair transition, about geopolitical issues, about technologies, about financing, about fair competition, and so on, and it's our responsibility to handle this complexity.
So I see your answer is it's complicated. Neither a yes or no, it's complicated.
The answer is we need the energy of the youth and the youth mobilization in Europe, such as coming from Greta. But then, as she said herself, it's our responsibility to design the right policies, and that's exactly what we try to do in the Parliament.
Mechthild, now that you're in the IEA, perhaps you're freer to say, EU member states doing enough or not enough? Or not fast enough?
I think relatively spoken, certainly a lot. Or enough is always relative, but I mean, I think they are on the very good way, EU. I mean, we haven't spoken about any other regions right now, and the starting point in China or India is much more different. I mean, they have a lot of coal and young coal power plant, so the switching to gas or retrofitting or phasing out, these are the issues. Europe is many steps ahead in all the areas we discussed. So I would say, yes, Europe is certainly on the right way, and I'm quite optimistic.
Adam, as a member state representative yourself, are EU member states doing enough and fast enough?
I am optimistic by nature, and I tend to think we can deal with that challenge. But obviously, it requires that we do much more. But we have to do much more, not only as member states, because what we can do as member states is actually limited. There are many areas where we will have to decide together in the EU that we are changing this or that standard, for instance, and these are the kind of decisions that we will need to take together. So I think it's not only a matter of member states acting individually. We really need to act together. And I agree that definitely the EU is the most ambitious of all the major economies in the world today. That is unquestionable, which still doesn't mean that there is not a lot of work ahead of us before we reach our targets, but I'm convinced we can do it.
Just to quickly follow up on a question that Poppy had raised in terms of the leverage of the EU to legislate also energy imports, and then also the leverage of the EU to legislate in the EU. Adam, what policy measures do you see necessary to be really focused on over the next years to make climate neutrality more possible? Are carbon pricing measures the way to go, or do you see that the focus should be more on, for example, tightening individual targets, be that for renewables, energy efficiency, or introducing new targets for other energy sources, for example?
So I think if you ask me, what do we need to do at EU level to reach the targets, I would say one of the first prerequisites to make our climate policy possible is to ensure that we will aim for a just transition. It's not only a matter of having nice words. It's not only a matter of having a just transition fund. It's really of thinking in each of the policy decisions that we take. Do we have assessed the impact of these policy, especially on the poorest, on the weakest of Europeans, and do we have the tools to alleviate the negative impacts on the most vulnerable of our citizens, to make sure that we can ensure a just transition forward? And this really needs to be a horizontal thinking when designing policies. Second thing that I think is very important is we should look at what will be required for the different sectors, and the answer may be very different from one sector to the other, of what is needed to reach our objectives. And this is obviously an exercise that requires a number of interactions with the concerned sectors, with the member states, with the NGOs, so that we can set up the proper measures to transform all the sectors, because it's not only a matter of transforming the energy sector. It's really a challenge for the entire economy, and we need to address that widely. I mean, you were one of the obvious candidate, and you were pointing to that obviously for the one of the legislative tools that we have in the EU is the ETS. Obviously, it is a tool we've been relying very, very, very much on, but which doesn't mean that it cannot be improved. I think there are several elements in the ETS that could be improved. I think we need, first of all, and it was mentioned by Poppy in her introductory remark, actually, when we need to look at the impact of our policies also on third countries, and how to make sure that we can mobilize others to act. Because if we design policies where we end up importing the same products that we were before producing in Europe, but from countries that are emitting more, then we're missing the point. I've looked at figures for different member states, and I've seen that the imported emissions in products were sometimes even eating up to 2/3 of the reductions that were achieved by these member states in DTS. So you can think, you still have a net gain, but it's much smaller than what it is in theory, and DTS is only a part of the answer. So obviously, one of the answer that we can use is trade policy, using taking climate perspective more into account in there. A carbon border adjustment, that's tools that we can use. Another major thing that we could improve, I believe, in the ETS is making sure that the investments are actually happening, are actually directed where they need to happen, where the biggest reductions potential are, the biggest investments needs are, and I think it's not the system today is not fulfilling that role perfectly. One of the weak points also I see of the ETS, and sometimes I hear many different lobbies saying, "Oh, we want also in the ETS," and I get to think, it's maybe that's because actually there is a way for some sectors to hide in the ETS and hoping the reductions won't concern them, but other sectors in DTS. So I think we really should think wisely of the tools we implement, so that we actually drive reductions across the whole economy, not saying, "Oh, we're going to let that area for later." And finally, one of the elements, but I already reflected in my more general comment at the beginning on that. But which is missing today in DTS is, I think, that social dimension, the impact that this instrument has on the poorest and the most vulnerable Europeans, and I think this is definitely something that we could improve further. So in a nutshell, I agree that we have a lot of tools already at hand, but that can be improved, and we really need to get in that discussion of the specific instruments we need to implement for transforming each of the sectors of the economy.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks also for mentioning the issue of imported emissions. And with that, I would like to turn to Mechthild, who's already mentioned developments, for example, in China, as well as in other emerging economies, that's something that perhaps doesn't always feature prominently in the Brussels debate, but needs to. So how do you see that global context play out, also in the context of the recovery debate, for example, now?
Yeah, thank you. As I mentioned, I think EU is leading in a lot of this debate. And when I compare it, it was one of your first questions for my previous job in the Commission and now in the IEA. What strikes me most is that Europe is very much focused on renewables, energy efficiency, clean technologies. Rightly so. I mean, it's the right debate. But the debate in other parts of the world is quite different. I mean, they are really trying to get the switch from coal to gas if possible, or they still have other technologies. They try to do energy efficiency, but they don't have the same means as well. So I think when we look at emerging countries, the EU can certainly try to be the example, but there is a mutual understanding that their position and their debate is quite different. The aim should be, and that's what we try to do also next week in a IEA summit, to bring everyone together around the energy and climate debate. So we can share together, but the mutual understanding, I think, that the parting position for some of our emerging countries who have less money, less technology knowledge, and need to focus maybe more on down-to-earth solutions than Europe can do. I think that is the aim of getting mutual understanding. So the role of gas, for example, which I listened to, and I think it's a very important debate. What is the role in the future, going to carbon neutral? It's also quite different in the emerging world. I mean, the gas is still seen as a possibility to get away from coal and gas, with the risk, and I see the same, that then the next switch should be renewables, and that's not easy. So even better to go renewables. But realistically, I think there is an affordable problem. There's a security of supply, like the Commissioner mentioned, also, which is much stronger in the emerging world.
Is that something that, for example, you think will need to become a bit more relevant in discussions over the next year as the EU moves ahead with stronger environmental legislation and towards a climate neutrality goal? Turning to KADRI, will that international dimension and awareness that the European example and the European experience may not be that of global partners have to play a bigger role also in the way you do climate diplomacy?
Absolutely. And as Mechthild in her introductory remarks mentioned, we are responsible only for 8% of the global emissions. So we might be very ambitious, but it's not enough. And we have been ambitious because only a year ago there was European election, and greenest groups in their manifestos were asking for 55% reduction target. And now we don't ask anymore if, but how we will achieve it. But we do have several active energy dialogues with other countries, and we always raise the climate concerns also. For example, last Monday, we had energy dialogue with China, and China is our partner on climate goals. But at the same time, we have to address the topic that also their foreign investments into the infrastructure of the countries, some of them very close to us, Western Balkans, Northern Africa, should be sustainable and not investments into the new coal-fired power plants.
So can we look forward towards a more, also in the relationship with China, perhaps with a bolder EU pushing its lines with international partners, especially as time is running out, to just have polite exchanges?
Of course, we are discussing those topics as openly as it is possible. Because of those new working methods, this energy dialogue didn't took place in Beijing. But we were here in Brussels, and partners were in China. But we have to keep in mind that global emissions do matter. And in that perspective, this message that our carbon border adjustment mechanism sends to our closest neighbors, that there is no point to invest into polluting installations because we will not be open market for this kind of production, is a strong message already.
So the message is already arriving in neighboring countries? The EU means business and better invest in cleaner energy?
I have this kind of impression that they do consider their future investments in this perspective, that will there be a market or will there be a competitive advantage for them if they don't mind their carbon footprint.
Thank you for that. Now I'd like to think to the results of the poll, which I'm being shown very shortly. Thanks very much for participating. And once then, I have one final round of questions for the panel. So going back to the poll, as you said in the beginning, the question was, what action will have the biggest impact in achieving a climate neutral EU by 2050? You've answered. 51% think that accelerating clean technologies such as electrification, hydrogen and biofuels. 38% say that targeting behavioral incentives, for example, improved energy efficiency and a higher carbon price, would be the action with the biggest impact. And just 11% say removing unavoidable emissions via carbon sinks would do the trick. So we see, thanks for that. And the Commission is also, in terms of popular opinion, right on spot with its hydrogen strategy. But now, turning with the last minutes that I have, I would be interested in hearing from the panelists. Imagine yourself in 2050, the EU has reached climate neutrality. For one, what kind of life do you live? Will you still be driving a car? Will you still live in the city? And will you still eat meat? And I'm starting with Mechthild.
I was just thinking about my son in 2050, who will be 47. Yeah, I think there is an impact from the crisis on our behavior. And that will impact cars. I mean, living in Paris, there are much more bikes and more efforts to be done. And I think that will be in other bigger cities all over. So I think there is a change. And Greta, who was mentioned before, I think the youth movement, and that's why I thought about the children, they push us and governments more. So I'm quite optimistic that it's not enough. Don't get me wrong. We need to government action, regulation, targets, and all that. But behavioral change is happening, and I hope though that in 2050 there are a lot. What you said, we have either EVs or bikes or walking and other technology advantages which are pushed and applied by the young people now who then are in the adult age. Thank you.
And you yourself will be that as well? Or have you already taken steps to make it climate neutral compatible?
I'm certainly biking in Paris. I don't eat meat. And what was the other question? Yes, I think we are all aware of it. We are all aware of it, and it's good to start by yourself. But as I said, it's not enough. But yes, thank you.
Adam, what does your 2050 life look like?
I think I'm likely to be retired in 2050, so I'm likely not to be living in a city anymore. We have so many nice spots in the countryside in Poland. I don't have a car already today, so I probably won't in 2050 either. And meat, meat is although I don't eat a lot, that's of meat. That's probably something I'm less inclined to imagine changing radically.
Thanks, Poppy. What's your 2050 self?
Well, I would like to think that it's going to be a much more active self than my current self. So I will hopefully be swimming a lot more and walking around a lot more as a pensioner. I've never driven a car in my life, so I hope I will keep walking even more and using much cooler public transport than I do now, which is already excellent. In terms of what we eat, I hope we already eat a lot more algae and products from the sea. So I'm very, very much looking forward to 2050. And I think today's picture is already very promising in that, women are also part of setting the vision of what 2050 looks like. So I think it will most definitely look a more inclusive and better place.
Thanks, Pascal.
Well, I will be 75 and I won't get a car. I don't have a car neither today, but I will drive cars when needed and only when needed, and they will be electric. And I will keep on eating meat, but only on very few occasions to have very good quality meat. Expensive ones, but good quality and less quantity. I think that's the right balance. And when it comes to the cities, I was born in a city, I live in the city, so I will live in cities, but probably way greener cities. Otherwise, by the way, we won't be able to live them, because we just mentioned mitigation in this debate. We didn't even mention the word adaptation, but I can tell you that that would be the top priority for European citizens, much more focused on the impact of climate change regarding adaptation than on mitigation.
Thanks. KADRI?
Well, I'm coming from the country where we do have lots of wild forests, and the leisurely activity that I like most is picking mushrooms. So most probably in year 2050 I have enough free time to pick enough mushrooms so that I don't need to eat anything else all year around. So, what a nice perspective.
Great. Well, thanks very much for that. And with that, I say thanks to the panel, thanks to KADRI for staying with us this time and for discussing climate neutrality and the path for Europe. Thanks to the audience for staying with us, for engaging online on Twitter and on Slido. And thanks for Shell for making the event possible. And do keep in mind this was the first of a series of events. So the next Politico Energy Visions event will take place in September, and it will focus on decarbonization in the different industrial sectors. Thanks very much. For that, I say goodbye.